In the glittering heart of Beverly Hills, where luxury cars line the streets and celebrities duck in and out of exclusive establishments, there stands Le Papillon, one of the most prestigious restaurants in Los Angeles. Comment below where you're watching from today, and let's dive into a story that proves appearances can be deceiving. On a quiet Tuesday evening, as the California sun began its descent behind the city's skyline, an elderly gentleman made his way toward the restaurant's ornate entrance. He wore a simple brown jacket that had seen better days, paired with well-worn jeans that spoke of comfort rather than fashion. His weathered face carried the kind of quiet dignity that comes from decades of life experience, though few would guess that this man was none other than Clint Eastwood, one of Hollywood's most legendary figures. The maitre d' was busy attending to a group of well-dressed socialites when Clint approached the podium. His reservation was for 7 o'clock. He'd arrived 30 minutes early to enjoy a moment of peace before meeting his grandson, a rising producer in the industry. This was typical of Clint. Despite his immense success, he had always preferred simplicity over showmanship. As he waited to be acknowledged, Clint observed the restaurant's opulent interior. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over hand-painted murals, while the soft melody of a grand piano floated through the air. Around him, diners dressed in designer clothes chatted over plates that cost more than most people's daily wages. Yet here stood Clint Eastwood, worth millions, dressed like he might be heading to a local diner rather than one of LA's most exclusive establishments. The maitre d' finally turned his attention to the new arrival, his eyes quickly scanning Clint's casual attire. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, but years of experience had taught him never to judge by appearances. He checked the reservation list and, recognizing the name, immediately straightened his posture. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome to Le Papillon. Your table is ready whenever you'd like to be seated." Clint nodded with his characteristic subtle smile. "Thank you. I'm a bit early, but I wouldn't mind sitting down." As they walked through the restaurant, few heads turned. In a city where image was everything, most diners were too absorbed in their own conversations or too focused on appearing important to notice the unassuming figure being led to one of the best tables in the house, a corner spot with a view of both the restaurant and the sunset beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. What no one realized in that moment was that this simple scene was about to become the beginning of a profound lesson in humility, respect, and the dangers of judging a book by its cover. Because sometimes, the most powerful people in the room are the ones who feel no need to prove their worth to anyone. Clint settled into his chair, politely declining the offer of a complimentary champagne. He preferred to wait for his grandson, content to observe the theater of life playing out around him. After all, he'd spent decades both in front of and behind the camera, but some of the most interesting stories were the ones that unfolded naturally, in places just like this. Little did anyone know that this ordinary evening was about to take an extraordinary turn, all because of one waiter's misguided assumptions and the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. As Clint sat there, his presence barely noticed by the other diners, the stage was being set for a story that would remind everyone that true class has nothing to do with what you wear and everything to do with how you treat others. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows through the windows, and somewhere in the kitchen, a young waiter named Marcus was about to begin his shift, unaware that his next customer would change his life forever. In the bustling kitchen of Le Papillon, Marcus straightened his pristine black vest and adjusted his bow tie for the third time that evening. At 26, he possessed the kind of striking features that belonged on movie posters, or at least, that's what he told himself every morning in the mirror. Tonight marked his second month at this prestigious establishment, a job he viewed not as a career, but as a stepping stone to his true destiny in Hollywood. Marcus had moved to Los Angeles 3 years ago from a small town in Missouri, carrying nothing but a suitcase full of dreams and an unshakable belief that he was meant for greatness. While his fellow waiters saw their roles as a profession, Marcus treated every shift as an audition. After all, you never knew which power player might walk through those doors, a director looking to cast their next blockbuster, or a producer searching for fresh talent. "Table 7 needs their wine topped up," called out Sandra, one of the senior servers. But Marcus was too busy rehearsing his latest monologue in his head while polishing already spotless wine glasses. He'd learned that the real money, and the real opportunities, came from recognizing and impressing the right people. Just last week, he'd served Martin Scorsese's longtime cinematographer, earning a generous tip and what he hoped was a memorable impression. "I'm telling you," Marcus whispered to Jake, another waiter with acting aspirations, "it's all about making connections. You think any of these successful people got where they are by waiting for opportunity to knock? No way. You have to seize the moment." Jake nodded absently, more focused on balancing a tray of appetizers than on Marcus's familiar speech. But Marcus continued, his voice carrying the practiced charm he'd perfected in countless acting workshops. "Take last night, for example. I had Steven Spielberg's sister at my table. You better believe I made sure to mention my background in theater. She said she'd pass my headshot along." Marcus conveniently left out that the woman had merely nodded politely while quickly changing the subject. The kitchen hummed with activity as the dinner service hit its peak. Chefs called out orders in rapid-fire French, and the clinking of fine china created a symphony of luxury. Marcus surveyed his section through the kitchen doors, mentally cataloguing each table's potential for advancing his career. "These people," he gestured broadly, "they come here expecting perfection. But what they're really looking for is someone who stands out, someone who understands their world." He'd repeated this philosophy so many times that he'd started believing it was some profound industry secret rather than the transparent ambition it really was. Sandra, passing by with a fresh batch of warm towels, rolled her eyes. "They're looking for good service, Marcus. Nothing more, nothing less." But Marcus had already stopped listening, his attention caught by the maitre d' approaching with the evening's table assignments. "Marcus, you'll be taking the corner table tonight. Single gentleman at the moment, but expecting company later." The maitre d' paused, something flickering across his face that Marcus didn't quite catch. "Just remember our standards of service." Marcus's heart sank slightly as he glanced toward his assigned section. The corner table, usually reserved for VIPs, was occupied by what appeared to be an elderly man in decidedly casual clothing. Not exactly the industry connection he'd been hoping for. "Of course," he replied, masking his disappointment with the practiced smile he'd perfected in his commercial audition workshops. "I'll give him the Le Papillon experience." Though in his mind he was already calculating how to spend more time at his other tables, the ones where people who mattered would be sitting. As he gathered his server's book and adjusted his perfectly styled hair one last time, Marcus ran through his mental checklist of Hollywood power players he needed to recognize on sight. He'd spent hours studying industry magazines and entertainment websites, memorizing faces and names, determined never to miss an opportunity. "Time to make magic happen," he muttered to himself, stepping out of the kitchen with the practiced grace of someone who viewed every movement as a potential scene in their future biopic. Little did Marcus know that this evening would indeed be memorable, just not in the way he imagined. The sun had nearly set now, casting a golden glow through the restaurant's windows. As Marcus approached the corner table, his mind was already elsewhere, dreaming of red carpets and acceptance speeches. He didn't realize that he was about to meet one of Hollywood's greatest legends, or that his carefully constructed world of superficial charm was about to come crashing down around him. For now, though, he was still riding high on his own self-importance, blissfully unaware that the next few hours would teach him the kind of lesson no acting class ever could. With each step toward Table 7, Marcus moved closer to a moment that would change his perspective forever, though not before he made the biggest mistake of his professional life. The first thing Marcus noticed as he approached the corner table was the worn leather jacket, the kind you might find at a thrift store, not the designer boutiques that lined Rodeo Drive. Its owner sat quietly, one weathered hand resting on the pristine white tablecloth, studying the menu with an unhurried calm that seemed out of place among the restaurant's usual clientele. "Good evening, sir," Marcus began, his tone carrying a subtle hint of condescension that he'd perfected for dealing with guests he deemed unworthy of his full attention. "Welcome to Le Papillon. May I start you with our water selection?" The elderly man looked up, his eyes carrying a quiet intensity that Marcus completely missed. "Just tap water is fine," came the reply, delivered in a gravelly voice that somehow commanded attention despite its softness. Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, In his mind, anyone who ordered tap water at Le Papillon clearly didn't belong here. "Are you familiar with our menu, sir?" he asked, emphasizing "sir" in a way that made it sound less like respect and more like an afterthought. "I've been here before," the man responded simply, his expression remaining neutral despite Marcus's barely concealed disdain. "Of course," Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he doubted this claim. "Well, let me walk you through some of our more accessible options." He leaned down, pointing to the least expensive items on the menu with the air of someone doing a great favor. The elderly man said nothing, simply watching as Marcus launched into an unsolicited explanation of the menu's basic items, deliberately skipping over the premium selections. Other diners at nearby tables began to notice the interaction, some frowning at Marcus's obvious prejudice. "Perhaps you'd be interested in our pasta selection," Marcus suggested, his voice carrying just enough volume for nearby tables to hear. "It's quite reasonable." He emphasized the last word as if he were doing a great service by steering this clearly lost soul toward the cheaper options. The man's face remained impassive, though something flickered in his eyes, not anger or frustration, but something deeper, more contemplative. "I'll need a few more minutes," he said quietly, his calm dignity in stark contrast to Marcus's increasingly patronizing behavior. "Of course, take all the time you need," Marcus replied, adding under his breath as he turned away, "It's not like you're our typical guest anyway." He didn't say it quite quietly enough. Several nearby diners shot him disapproving looks, but he was too caught up in his own prejudices to notice. As Marcus retreated to his other tables, he made a show of providing exemplary service to the well-dressed guests, speaking loudly about the finest wines and most expensive dishes. Every few minutes, he would glance back at the corner table, making sure the elderly man could see the difference in treatment. "Is everything all right with your soup, madame?" he asked a woman dripping in jewelry at the adjacent table, his voice carrying deliberately to the corner. "We can have the chef prepare something else if it's not to your refined taste." The woman shifted uncomfortably, aware of the server's obvious performance. Throughout it all, the man in the corner remained unruffled, occasionally glancing out the window at the darkening Los Angeles skyline. His patience seemed to irritate Marcus even more, who had expected, perhaps even hoped for, some sign of discomfort or embarrassment. "He's probably lost," Marcus whispered to another server passing by. "Wandered in here thinking it was a diner or something. Should have seen his face when I mentioned the water selection." The other server shot him a warning look but hurried away without commenting. The minutes ticked by, and Marcus's behavior grew increasingly obvious. He would walk past the corner table without acknowledging its occupant, then stop at nearby tables to enthusiastically discuss the wine list or specialty dishes. Each time he did this, the man's expression remained unchanged, almost as if he found the whole display quietly amusing. What Marcus failed to notice in his rush to judge based on appearances were the subtle signs that might have warned him. The way other staff members glanced nervously at the corner table, the growing disapproval on the faces of nearby diners, and most importantly, the quiet authority that emanated from the man he was so casually dismissing. As the evening light faded outside, casting long shadows across the restaurant's elegant interior, Marcus remained oblivious to the fact that he was digging himself deeper into a hole with every passing moment. He couldn't have known that his next interaction with this unassuming guest would begin a chain of events that would shake his carefully constructed worldview to its core. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the real drama was about to unfold, though not in any way Marcus could have anticipated. Sometimes the harshest lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, and this evening was about to deliver a masterclass in humility that no amount of acting workshops could have prepared him for. The dinner service continued its elegant dance around Le Papillon, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort growing around table 7. Marcus had escalated from subtle condescension to more overt displays of disrespect, each interaction becoming more charged than the last. "Have you come to a decision, sir?" Marcus asked, approaching the corner table with an exaggerated slowness, as if expecting to have to explain the menu all over again. "I can remind you about our more budget-conscious options." The last words dripped with barely concealed derision. The man in the worn jacket looked up from his menu, his face still maintaining that same unruffled composure, that had begun to gnaw at Marcus's professional veneer. "I'll start with the truffle risotto," he said, his gravelly voice carrying no hint of reaction to Marcus's tone. Marcus's eyebrows shot up dramatically, making sure nearby tables could witness his performance. "The truffle risotto?" he repeated, emphasizing each syllable as if speaking to someone who didn't understand the words. "That's one of our more premium dishes. Perhaps I should mention that it's priced at $120. A couple at the next table shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the wife whispering something disapproving to her husband. But Marcus was too invested in his act to notice the growing disapproval around him. "The risotto will be fine," the man replied simply, seemingly immune to Marcus's theatrical concern about the price. "Very well," Marcus replied, his voice rising slightly to ensure he had an audience. "And should I bring you another glass of tap water to go with your $120 risotto?" The sarcasm in his voice was impossible to miss. A silence fell over the nearby tables. The man simply nodded, either oblivious to or choosing to ignore the waiter's increasingly inappropriate behavior. But others weren't so willing to overlook it. The maitre d' had paused in his rounds, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Marcus turned on his heel, making a show of rolling his eyes as he headed toward the kitchen. On his way, he stopped at several other tables, his voice carrying clearly across the restaurant. "Ah, Mrs. Davidson, another glass of the Chateau Margaux. An excellent choice. Now that's what I call refined taste." When the risotto arrived, Marcus's performance reached new heights. He placed the dish before the man with exaggerated ceremony, his voice dripping with mock sophistication. "Your risotto, sir. Do be careful. The gold leaf garnish probably cost more than that jacket of yours." Several gasps emerged from nearby tables. The man in the corner simply picked up his fork and began to eat, but others were visibly disturbed by the server's behavior. A woman in designer clothing at the adjacent table caught Marcus's eye and shook her head slightly, but he mistook her disapproval for solidarity. "Don't worry, madam," he said to her in a stage whisper. "We get all sorts here these days, though usually they stick to the cafe down the street." The woman's face flushed with embarrassment, not at the man in the corner, but at Marcus's shocking lack of professionalism. As the man ate his risotto in peaceful silence, Marcus continued his rounds, each pass by the corner table accompanied by some new subtle slight. He would adjust the silverware unnecessarily, commenting loudly about proper fine dining etiquette. He topped up water glasses at every other table with flourish, while pointedly ignoring the man's empty glass. "Is everything satisfactory?" Marcus asked later, his tone suggesting he expected complaints about the price rather than the food. "I know it might be different from what you're used to." The man dabbed his mouth with his napkin and looked up at Marcus with those same steady eyes. "The risotto is excellent," he said simply. "I'd like to see the wine list for my main course." Marcus's face froze for a moment before he recovered with an exaggerated flourish. "The wine list?" "Of course. Though perhaps I should warn you that our wines start at $300 per bottle." He emphasized the price, waiting for the man to withdraw the request. Instead, the man simply nodded. "The wine list, please." The tension in the surrounding area had become palpable. Other diners were now openly watching the interaction, their own meals forgotten. The maitre d' had begun moving in their direction, perhaps finally ready to intervene, when the restaurant's front doors opened. Marcus, still clutching his leather-bound wine list, didn't notice the new arrival. He was too busy preparing his next passive-aggressive comment about wine appreciation and refinement. But he did notice when the atmosphere in the restaurant suddenly shifted, like a change in pressure before a storm. The stage was set for the evening's turning point, though Marcus remained blissfully unaware that his carefully constructed world of judgment and prejudice was about to come crashing down around him. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come at the moment we least expect them, and Marcus's moment of truth was walking through the door. It was the wine order that finally pushed Marcus over the edge of professionalism into outright confrontation. The man in the corner had calmly perused the wine list, taking his time as if the exorbitant prices meant nothing to him. When he finally looked up, his choice made Marcus's carefully maintained facade crack completely. "I'll have the 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild," the man said quietly, his gravelly voice carrying no hint of hesitation. Marcus's jaw physically dropped. The bottle in question was one of Le Papillon's crown jewels, a $15,000 wine that even the restaurant's wealthiest patrons rarely ordered. His voice rose several octaves as he responded, loud enough now that heads turned throughout the dining room. "I'm sorry, sir, but perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus announced theatrically, making sure his voice carried to every corner of the restaurant. "That bottle of wine cost $15,000. That's $15,000. Perhaps you misread the price?" He leaned down, pointing at the menu as if teaching a child to read. The man in the worn jacket showed no reaction to Marcus's outburst. "I'm aware of the price," he replied calmly. "The 82 Lafite will be fine." Marcus straightened up, his face flushing red. This was too much. This had to be some sort of prank. In his mind, there was no way this simply dressed elderly man could possibly afford such a wine. His voice took on a sharp, almost hostile edge. "Sir, I don't mean to be rude," though that was exactly what he meant to be. "But this is a bottle of wine that costs more than most cars. I cannot in good conscience bring you this wine without making absolutely certain you understand what you're ordering. Perhaps something from our house selection would be more appropriate for your situation." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every diner, every server, even the busboys had stopped to watch the scene unfolding. The man's continued calm in the face of Marcus's increasingly aggressive behavior seemed to only fuel the waiter's indignation. "Look," Marcus continued, his voice now dripping with condescension. "I can see you're trying to impress someone, but this is getting ridiculous. That jacket you're wearing probably came from a thrift store. Those jeans have seen better days. I'm trying to save you from embarrassment here. We both know you can't afford this wine." A woman at a nearby table gasped audibly. Someone else muttered, "Disgraceful." But Marcus was too far gone to notice or care. In his mind, he was protecting the restaurant's integrity, preventing what he assumed must be some sort of scam. "Perhaps," he said, his voice now loud enough to reach the kitchen. "You'd be more comfortable at the diner down the street. They serve wine by the glass there. Much more your speed, I'd imagine." The man slowly placed the wine list down on the table. For the first time that evening, something changed in his expression. Not anger, but something more like disappointment, as if Marcus had failed some sort of test. "Young man," he began, his voice still quiet but somehow filling the entire restaurant, "I've been very patient with your behavior this evening, but—" Marcus cut him off, his professional demeanor completely abandoned. "No, sir, I've been patient with you. Coming in here dressed like that, ordering our most expensive dishes and wines. This isn't some coffee shop where you can pretend to be something you're not. This is Le Papillon. We have standards." The maitre d' was now hurrying toward the table, his face ashen. A few tables away, a group of diners had begun recording the scene on their phones, but Marcus was too caught up in his self-righteous indignation to notice any of it. "I mean, honestly," he continued, gesturing wildly at the man's clothes, "did you really think you could pull this off? Did you think nobody would notice that you don't belong here? That jacket probably cost less than the appetizers. I bet you've never even tasted fine wine in your life." Just then, the front doors of the restaurant opened. A well-dressed man in his 40s entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. But Marcus, lost in his tirade, didn't notice. He was too busy delivering what he thought would be the final blow to this presumptuous intruder. "So why don't you do us all a favor," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "and leave before you embarrass yourself further? I'm sure there's a fast food restaurant nearby that would be happy to—" "Dad?" The voice came from behind Marcus, cutting through his rant like a knife. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic on Sunset was terrible." Marcus turned, confusion crossing his face as he saw the well-dressed man approaching. But it wasn't until he heard the whispers erupting around him. "That's Clint Eastwood! Oh my God, it's really him!" that the color began to drain from his face. In that moment, as realization dawned, Marcus felt the floor beneath his feet begin to disappear. He turned back to look at the man in the corner, seeing him, truly seeing him, for the first time that evening. And in those famous eyes he saw not anger, but something that would haunt him far more. Disappointment. The restaurant erupted into a flurry of whispers and gasps as Kyle Eastwood, Clint's son and a successful film producer in his own right, made his way to the corner table. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as the reality of his monumental mistake crashed over him in waves. "I saw that 82 Lafitte on the wine list last time," Kyle said casually, embracing his father. "Knew you'd want to try it." He turned to Marcus, whose complexion had gone from red with indignation to ghostly pale in a matter of seconds. "I trust my father's been well taken care of?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Around them, the whispers had grown louder, and phones were discreetly recording the unfolding scene. Fragments of conversations floated through the air. That waiter had no idea. Treated Clint Eastwood like that. Going to lose his job for sure. I. Marcus stammered, his carefully cultivated air of superiority evaporating like morning dew in the California sun. His eyes darted between father and son, recognition finally setting in. The man he'd been belittling all evening wasn't just any customer. He was Clint Eastwood, legendary actor, director, and Hollywood icon. The maitre d' appeared at Marcus's elbow, his face a mask of professional calm, barely concealing his horror at the situation. "Mr. Eastwood, please accept our most sincere apologies for any discomfort you've experienced this evening. Marcus, you're dismissed for the night. We'll discuss this tomorrow." But Clint raised a hand, his gesture stopping both the maitre d' and Marcus in their tracks. "That won't be necessary," he said, his distinctive voice now commanding the attention it deserved. "I'd like Marcus to stay." The other diners were now openly staring, their own meals forgotten. Someone at a nearby table whispered, "Classic Dirty Harry moment coming up." Another murmured, "Make my day," drawing nervous laughter from their companions. Kyle settled into his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd seen that look in his father's eyes before. Not anger, but the calm determination that had made him a legend, both on and off the screen. "Son," Clint said, addressing Marcus directly, "why don't you bring us that bottle of Lafitte now? I think we all could use a drink." Marcus's hands were trembling so badly he nearly dropped his order pad. "Right. Right away, Mr. Eastwood, sir. I had no idea. The wine, Marcus," Clint repeated gently, but with that unmistakable authority that had commanded screens for decades. As Marcus practically ran toward the wine cellar, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though the energy had shifted dramatically. Those who had witnessed the earlier confrontations were now sharing the story with other diners, and the tale was already growing in the telling. "You could have said something, Dad," Kyle remarked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Saved the poor kid some embarrassment." Clint adjusted his worn jacket, the same one he'd had for years, despite his family's constant attempts to replace it. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our mistakes," he replied. "Though I have to admit this one might have been a bit more dramatic than I anticipated." Marcus returned with the wine, his earlier swagger replaced by nervous humility. His hands shook as he presented the bottle, nearly fumbling the ceremonial opening. As he poured the first taste for Clint's approval, a drop splashed onto the tablecloth, something that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Eastwood," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was completely out of line. I made assumptions and I was wrong and I—" "Marcus," Clint interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind, "we'll discuss it. But first, let's enjoy this excellent wine. Though I have to say," and here a hint of that famous half-smile appeared, "for $15,000 it better be damn good." The tension in Marcus's shoulders eased slightly at the small joke, though his face remained flushed with shame. As he finished pouring the wine, he couldn't help but notice how many people were still watching, how many phones were still discreetly recording. By morning, he knew this story would be all over social media. What he didn't know yet was that this evening would change not just his career, but his entire perspective on life. The lesson was just beginning, and Clint Eastwood, despite being the target of his prejudice and rudeness, was about to become his most important teacher. As Marcus stepped back from the table, still reeling from the revelation, he caught fragments of conversation from nearby diners. "Can't believe he's so humble. Wearing that old jacket like it's nothing. True class isn't about what you wear." The evening was far from over, and the real lessons were yet to come. But in that moment, as Marcus watched Clint Eastwood calmly sip the wine he'd so rudely tried to deny him, one thing was already crystal clear. He had monumentally misjudged not just a customer, but a legend, and his world would never be quite the same. The news spread through Le Papillon like wildfire, traveling from table to table, from the kitchen to the bar, and even reaching the valets outside. "Did you hear what happened? That waiter insulted Clint Eastwood. Can you believe he tried to stop him from ordering wine?" Each retelling added new layers to the story, though the reality was dramatic enough without embellishment. Marcus stood at his service station, his body physically present, but his mind somewhere else entirely, replaying every mortifying moment of the evening. Other servers passed by, some offering sympathetic glances, others barely concealing their satisfaction at his downfall. After all, he'd spent months acting superior to them all. "Marcus." The maitre d's voice cut through his daze. "Mr. Davidson's table needs attention." He gestured to a table that had previously been under Marcus's care, now being served by another waiter. "Just observe for now. We'll discuss your position tomorrow." From his corner of shame, Marcus watched as life in the restaurant continued. Clint and Kyle Eastwood enjoyed their meal, speaking quietly and occasionally laughing. Several well-known industry figures had appeared, drawn by the quickly spreading word of Clint's presence, but the legend himself remained focused on his son, seemingly oblivious to the stir he'd created. The restaurant's owner, Mr. Laurent, had emerged from his office, making his way to the Eastwoods' table to offer profuse apologies. But Clint simply shook his head and said something that made the owner relax visibly. Still, Mr. Laurent's sharp glance toward Marcus spoke volumes about the conversation they would have tomorrow. "I heard he's getting fired for sure," whispered one of the busboys to another as they passed Marcus's station. "Can you blame them? Treating Clint Eastwood like that? That's career suicide in this town." Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket, messages from friends who'd somehow already heard about the incident. Word traveled fast in Los Angeles, especially when it involved a Hollywood legend and an embarrassing case of mistaken identity. He couldn't bear to read them. As the evening wore on, Marcus noticed something that made his stomach sink even further. Despite his atrocious behavior, Clint Eastwood was treating his new server with simple kindness and respect, the very things Marcus had failed to show him. There was no hint of revenge or satisfaction in the legend's demeanor, which somehow made Marcus feel even worse. "The kitchen needs to know if you're keeping your other tables," Sandra said, approaching Marcus with a mix of pity and professional concern. "Jake can cover them if—" "Mr. Marcus?" A host appeared, looking nervous. "Mr. Eastwood would like to speak with you at your convenience." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Several nearby servers paused in their tasks, watching to see what would happen. Marcus felt his legs turn to jelly, but he knew he had no choice. With leaden feet, he made his way toward the corner table. Clint Eastwood looked up as he approached, those famous eyes fixing him with a gaze that had commanded screens for decades. Kyle sat back, watching with interest as his father gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down, son," Clint said, his gravelly voice somehow both gentle and commanding. Marcus sank into the chair, acutely aware that dozens of eyes were watching this interaction. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but Clint raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not interested in more apologies," he said simply. "What I am interested in is understanding why." "Why?" Marcus repeated weakly. "Why you felt the need to judge someone based on their appearance. Why you thought treating anyone, regardless of who they turned out to be, with such disrespect was acceptable." The question hung in the air between them. In the background, the normal sounds of the restaurant continued: clinking glasses, murmured conversations, the soft notes of piano music. But at this table, time seemed to stand still. Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. In this industry, appearance is everything. Or at least I thought it was. Clint nodded slowly, taking a sip of the wine that had sparked the final confrontation. "And how's that working out for you?" The simple question, delivered without malice but with devastating accuracy, cut straight to Marcus's core. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he forced them back. He didn't deserve the relief of crying. "I've spent 3 years in LA, he found himself saying, the words tumbling out, "trying to make it as an actor, telling myself that if I just knew the right people, impressed the right people, I turned into exactly the kind of person I used to hate back home." Kyle shifted in his seat, sharing a look with his father that Marcus couldn't quite interpret. Around them, the restaurant had begun to empty, the dinner service winding down, but this corner table remained in its own bubble of tension and truth. The evening's events had shattered more than just Marcus's professional facade. They'd cracked open the carefully constructed shell of superiority he'd built around himself since arriving in Los Angeles. And now, sitting across from the man he'd so grievously misjudged, he felt stripped bare, his dreams and delusions laid out for examination under the harsh light of reality. What he didn't know yet was that this conversation was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, respect, and the true nature of character in Hollywood. "You know," Clint began, his voice carrying that distinctive gravel that had commanded attention for decades, "when I first came to Hollywood, I was a pool cleaner at Universal Studios." He paused, letting that sink in. Didn't exactly look the part of a movie star back then either. Marcus sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break this surreal moment. Around them, the restaurant staff had begun the subtle dance of preparing for closing, though everyone within earshot was clearly straining to hear the conversation. "I didn't know that," Marcus said softly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. "Most don't," Clint continued, swirling the expensive wine in his glass. "Everyone sees the end result, the success, the fame, the fortune. They don't see the struggle, the humble beginnings, the lessons learned along the way." His eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the young waiter want to look away, but somehow couldn't. "But that's not why I wanted to talk to you," Clint said, setting his glass down. "I wanted to talk about something more important than my career. I wanted to talk about character." Kyle, who had been quietly observing, smiled slightly. He'd seen his father in this mode before, not the tough guy from the movies, but the mentor, the teacher, the man who believed in second chances. "The way you treated me tonight," Clint continued, "wasn't just about not recognizing me. It was about not recognizing the basic dignity in another human being. That's a far bigger mistake than not spotting a celebrity." Marcus felt the heat rise in his face again, but Clint wasn't finished. "You're trying to make it in Hollywood, right? As an actor?" When Marcus nodded, Clint leaned forward slightly. "Then let me tell you something about this business that took me years to learn. The most important role you'll ever play is yourself. And tonight, son, you were playing the wrong character." The words hit Marcus like a physical force. He thought about all the networking events he'd attended, all the times he'd put on what he thought was his Hollywood personality, all the people he'd dismissed because they didn't fit his image of success. "I've watched people come and go in this town for over 50 years, Clint continued. "The ones who last, the ones who really make it. They're not the ones who step on others to climb up. They're the ones who remember where they came from and treat everyone with respect, regardless of their position." Kyle nodded in agreement. "Dad's worn that same jacket to Oscar ceremonies," he added with a smile. "Drives my mother crazy." "The point is," Clint said, "success isn't about looking the part. It's about being genuine, being humble, and most importantly, being kind. Those are the qualities that last long after the spotlight fades." Marcus felt tears welling up again, but this time he didn't fight them. "I've been so focused on trying to be somebody," he whispered, "that I forgot how to be anybody at all." "That's a good line," Clint remarked with a hint of his famous half-smile. "Write that one down, but more importantly, remember it." The restaurant had grown quieter, the last of the regular diners having departed. Only a few tables remained occupied, their occupants clearly lingering to witness this extraordinary scene. "So, here's what's going to happen," Clint said, his tone shifting slightly. "Tomorrow you're going to come back to work. You're going to apologize to your colleagues for any arrogance you've shown in the past. And you're going to start treating every single person who walks through that door, whether they're wearing Armani or Army surplus, with the same respect and dignity they deserve." Marcus looked up in surprise. You're going to help me keep my job?" "I'm going to give you a chance to earn it back," Clint corrected. "What you do with that chance is up to you. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth, but only if we're willing to learn from them." The wisdom in those words, delivered without pretense or condemnation, struck a chord deep within Marcus. He thought about all the times he'd judged people based on their appearance, all the potential connections and friendships he'd dismissed because they didn't fit his narrow view of success. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood," he managed to say. "I don't deserve this kindness." "Maybe not," Clint agreed, "but deserving something and needing something aren't always the same thing. Sometimes we need the things we deserve the least, like a second chance." As these words settled over the table, Marcus realized he was being offered more than just job security. He was being offered a chance to rewrite his own character, to step out of the role he'd been playing and find his authentic self. The lessons of this evening would continue to unfold, but in this moment, sitting across from a legend who'd chosen teaching over punishment, Marcus felt the first stirrings of real change beginning to take root in his heart. "Now," Clint said, his voice taking on a more conversational tone, "tell me about your acting dreams. What brought you to Los Angeles?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd expected more lecturing, more deserved criticism, not this genuine interest in his aspirations. He hesitated, suddenly feeling the weight of his earlier pretensions. "I came here 3 years ago from Missouri. Did some theater back home, thought I could make it big out here." He let out a hollow laugh. "Sounds pretty naive now." "Not at all," Clint responded, surprising Marcus again. "Everyone in this town started somewhere. The question is, what have you been doing about it besides serving tables and judging people?" Kyle leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Have you been auditioning? Taking classes?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Some workshops here and there. Mostly I've been, trying to network." He felt embarrassed now, remembering his strategy of sucking up to important-looking customers while dismissing others. "Let me tell you something about acting," Clint said, his eyes taking on a distant look. "It's not about pretending to be someone else. It's about finding truth in yourself and bringing that truth to the character. But you can't do that if you're too busy pretending in your real life." The words hit home. Marcus thought about all the different personas he'd adopted since coming to LA, the sophisticated waiter, the ambitious networker, the industry insider. None of them had been real. "When I started out," Clint continued, "I was terrible. Absolutely terrible. Know why?" He didn't wait for Marcus to respond. "Because I was trying to be what I thought an actor should be instead of bringing myself to the role. Took me years to figure that out." "But you're Clint Eastwood," Marcus said, still struggling to reconcile the legend with this down-to-earth mentor figure before him. "Exactly," Clint replied with a slight smile. "I'm Clint Eastwood because I stopped trying to be anyone else. The moments that defined my career came when I was most authentic, not when I was trying to fit someone else's mold." Kyle nodded in agreement. "I've seen countless talented actors come and go in this town," he added. "The ones who make it aren't always the most talented. They're the ones who stay true to themselves and put in the real work." "Real work?" Marcus asked, suddenly eager to learn. "Study your craft," Clint said firmly. "Not just acting classes. Study life. Study people. Every person who walks through those doors has a story. Instead of judging them, try to understand them. That's what acting is really about." Marcus thought about all the customers he'd dismissed, all the stories he'd missed because he was too busy trying to spot celebrities. "I've been doing everything wrong, haven't I?" "Not everything," Clint corrected. "You've got passion. You've got drive. You're just pointing them in the wrong direction. Success in this business isn't about who you know. It's about who you are. The restaurant had grown quiet around them, the late hour clearing out the last of the regular diners. Staff members moved silently about their closing duties, all while stealing glances at this impromptu masterclass taking place in their midst. I started in TV westerns, Clint continued. Bit parts, background roles. Every role was a chance to learn, to observe, to grow. Even now, after all these years, I'm still learning. The moment you think you know it all is the moment you stop growing as an actor and as a person. Marcus absorbed these words, feeling their weight. How do I start over? He asked quietly. After tonight. After everything. You start by being honest, Clint replied. With yourself first, then with everyone else. Take acting classes, real ones, not just networking workshops. Study the craft, read scripts, watch performances, but most importantly, start seeing people, really seeing them. And remember, Kyle added, every role you take, whether it's a waiter, a student, or an extra in the background, is a chance to practice your craft. How you play those roles says everything about who you are as an actor and as a person. Clint nodded in agreement. The way you've been treating customers here, that's been your audition all along, and until tonight, you've been playing the wrong part. The truth of these words settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. Every interaction, every dismissive comment, every judgment he'd made had been a performance, just not the kind he should have been giving. Thank you, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Not just for the advice, but for showing me what real character looks like. Don't thank me yet, Clint replied with that characteristic half-smile, the hard part still ahead. But if you're willing to do the work, the real work, you might just surprise yourself. As the conversation drew to a close, Marcus realized he'd received something far more valuable than any networking opportunity or industry connection. He'd been given a masterclass in humanity, taught by someone who had reached the pinnacle of success without losing his fundamental decency. The night was ending, but for Marcus, something new was just beginning. The question was, would he be ready for the challenge ahead? The next morning, Marcus sat in his small Studio City apartment, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at him seemed different somehow, less certain, less polished, but perhaps more real than it had been in years. Who are you really? He whispered to his reflection, echoing the question that had kept him awake most of the night. The events at Le Papillon played on repeat in his mind, each replay more cringe-worthy than the last. His phone lay silent on the counter, though he knew it was filled with unread messages and social media notifications. Word had spread quickly through LA's restaurant community. He picked up his phone, finally ready to face the digital aftermath. The first video he found had already gathered thousands of views. Waiter learns harsh lesson after humiliating Clint Eastwood. Another was titled Hollywood Legend School's Arrogant Server. His hands trembled as he watched himself on screen, seeing his behavior through others' eyes for the first time. God, I was awful, he muttered, watching his recorded self make snide comments about Clint's jacket. The comments section was brutal, filled with people sharing their own stories of encountering celebrities who remained humble despite their success. Marcus opened his closet, looking at the carefully curated wardrobe he'd assembled over 3 years in LA. Designer labels he could barely afford, bought on credit because he thought they'd help him fit in. Next to them hung his waiter's uniform for Le Papillon, a symbol of both his survival job and his failed networking strategy. He thought about Clint's worn leather jacket, how the legend had worn it with such ease, completely unconcerned with others' opinions. The contrast with Marcus's own carefully constructed image couldn't have been starker. Opening his laptop, he began searching through his emails. There they were. Dozens of notifications for expensive networking events, acting workshops promising industry connections, and pitch sessions that had drained his bank account but led nowhere. He'd been so focused on looking successful that he'd forgotten to actually work on his craft. His eyes fell on an old theater textbook from his college days in Missouri, dusty and untouched since he'd moved to LA. He picked it up, remembering the passion he'd once had for the actual art of acting, before he'd become obsessed with the trappings of Hollywood success. "The most important role you'll ever play is yourself," he repeated Clint's words aloud, letting their truth sink in. How long had it been since he'd been himself? Really himself? He thought about his behavior at the restaurant over the past months, not just last night, but all the nights before. The way he'd suck up to well-dressed guests while dismissing others. The subtle digs at colleagues he'd deemed beneath him. The constant performance of someone he thought he needed to be. Standing up, Marcus walked to his vision board, a collection of magazine cutouts showing luxury cars, red carpet events, and Hollywood mansions. With trembling hands, he began taking it down, piece by piece. These weren't his dreams. They were props in the fake life he'd been trying to create. His phone buzzed. A message from Jake, his fellow waiter. "You coming in today? Mr. Laurent wants to see you." Marcus had almost forgotten about his job, about facing his colleagues after last night's humiliation. But Clint's words echoed in his mind again. "Tomorrow, you're going to come back to work." Looking in the mirror one last time, Marcus made a decision. He changed into his uniform, but this time he saw it differently. Not as a costume in his networking performance, but as what it really was, a symbol of honest work, of service, of humility. Before leaving, he opened his laptop one more time. Instead of checking industry networking events, he searched for acting classes Los Angeles, not the fancy showcase workshops he'd been attending, but real classes focused on craft and technique. He found one that started next week, taught by a veteran character actor he'd never heard of. Perfect. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed again. Another video of last night had gone viral. But this time, instead of feeling shame, Marcus felt something different. Gratitude. Sometimes the most painful moments could be the most valuable, if you were willing to learn from them. The morning sun was bright as he drove toward Le Papillon, toward whatever consequences awaited him. But for the first time in years, Marcus wasn't acting. He wasn't playing a role or trying to impress anyone. He was just himself, a young man from Missouri who'd lost his way but was finally ready to find it again. Last night, Clint Eastwood had given him more than a second chance at his job. He'd given him a chance to rediscover who he really was beneath all the pretense and performance. Now it was up to Marcus to make that chance count. As he parked his car behind the restaurant, he took a deep breath. The hardest scene in this story was about to begin. Not a performance, but something far more challenging, being genuine. Marcus stood outside the staff entrance of Le Papillon, his hand hovering over the door handle. Through the window he could see his colleagues preparing for another day of service. Sandra was polishing glasses, Jake was checking table settings, and the kitchen staff was already busy with prep work. All of them had witnessed his humiliation last night. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The usual morning chatter died immediately, replaced by a heavy silence. All eyes turned to him, some curious, others disapproving, a few sympathetic. Marcus forced himself to stand straight, fighting the urge to duck his head and hurry past them. "I owe all of you an apology," he said, his voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. "Not just for last night, but for every day before that. I've been awful to work with, and I'm sorry." Sandra paused in her glass polishing, studying him with experienced eyes. She'd been at Le Papillon for 15 years and had seen countless servers come and go, their Hollywood dreams rising and falling like soufflés in the kitchen. "You know," she said finally, "I worked here the first time Clint Eastwood came in. Years ago. He remembered my name from that visit, every time he came back after. That's the kind of person he is." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I think I'm finally beginning to understand that. About him, about all of this." He gestured around the restaurant. "I've been looking down on this job, on all of you, because I thought I was meant for something bigger. But the truth is I was the small one." Jake stepped forward, adjusting a tablecloth. "We've all had our Hollywood dreams, Marcus. Some of us still do. But that doesn't mean we have to stop being human while we chase them." The kitchen door swung open and Chef Michel emerged, his usual stern expression in place. Ah, the celebrity critic has returned, he said, his French accent thick with irony. Perhaps today you will judge my cooking as harshly as you judge the guests, non? Marcus felt his face flush, remembering all the times he'd made snide comments about guests' orders, trying to appear sophisticated. Your cooking has always been extraordinary, chef. I was the one who was distasteful. A hint of a smile touched the chef's lips. Perhaps there is hope for you yet. Now, Mr. Laurent is waiting in his office. Best not to keep him waiting. He's been practicing his firing speech all morning. Marcus's heart sank, but he squared his shoulders. Thank you, all of you. Whatever happens with Mr. Laurent, I needed to say this. He turned toward the office, then paused. And chef? That coq au vin you made last week? It really was the best I've ever had. The walk to Mr. Laurent's office felt like the longest of his life. Each step was an opportunity to reflect on another mistake, another moment of arrogance, another burnt bridge he'd need to rebuild. But strangely, he felt lighter with each step. The truth, even when it hurt, was far less burdensome than pretense. Mr. Laurent was seated behind his desk, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. The phone on his desk was lighting up with messages, no doubt the aftermath of last night's event still rippling through Los Angeles. Sit down, Marcus, he said, his voice tired but not angry. I've had some interesting calls this morning. It seems you've made quite an impression on social media. Marcus sat, forcing himself to meet his boss's eyes. I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions, sir. Are you? Mr. Laurent leaned forward. Because the consequences might not be what you expect. I received a call from Mr. Eastwood's agent this morning. It seems he was quite insistent that you should keep your job. Marcus blinked in surprise. What? He said something about teaching moments and second chances. Personally, I think you deserve to be fired. Mr. Laurent's eyes were sharp. But I've learned over the years to trust Clint Eastwood's judgment. So here's what's going to happen. The morning light streamed through the office window, casting long shadows across the desk between them. In that moment, Marcus realized that whatever came next, whether punishment or probation, would be another step in the journey that had begun last night. A journey not toward Hollywood success, but toward something far more valuable, genuine character. The road to redemption would be long, but for the first time Marcus was ready to walk it with honesty and humility. The spotlight he'd been chasing seemed less important now than the simple respect of the people around him. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest roles we play are the ones that don't come with any applause at all. 6 months had passed since that fateful night at Le Papillon. The videos had long since gone viral, been forgotten, and replaced by newer social media sensations. But for Marcus, every day brought fresh reminders of the lessons he'd learned at that corner table. He still worked at Le Papillon, though everything about his approach had changed. Where once he'd seen each table as a networking opportunity, he now saw people. Real people, with stories and lives that fascinated him. His genuine interest in guests had earned him a loyal following, and his tips had actually improved since he'd stopped trying to impress everyone. Table 7 loved your service tonight, Sandra said as they closed up one evening. Said it was the most genuine interaction they'd had in LA all week. Marcus smiled, remembering how that same Table 7 had been the scene of his greatest humiliation and most valuable lesson. You know, I had an audition today, he said, carefully polishing a wine glass. For a small role in an independent film. How'd it go? Sandra asked, genuine interest in her voice. I didn't get it, Marcus replied, but his smile didn't fade. But the director said something interesting. Said I had an authenticity he hadn't seen in my previous auditions. Said to keep coming back. The acting classes he'd started taking, real classes, focused on craft rather than connections, had begun to change his approach to both acting and life. His teacher, a veteran character actor named Frank, had become something of a mentor. You're not playing roles anymore, Frank had told him last week. You're finding truth. That's what Eastwood was trying to teach you that night. The restaurant had changed too, in subtle ways. Mr. Laurent had instituted a new training program for staff, emphasizing genuine service over superficial sophistication. He'd even framed a small photo of Clint Eastwood in his worn jacket, hanging it near the entrance as a reminder that true class had nothing to do with appearances. Marcus's phone buzzed, a message from Kyle Eastwood. They'd kept in loose contact over the months, with Kyle occasionally offering advice or encouragement. Today's message was simple. Dad's coming in next week. Says he's curious to see how you're doing. The news didn't fill Marcus with anxiety as it once might have. Instead, he felt a quiet gratitude. He'd learned more about acting and about life from that one humbling evening than from all his previous years of networking combined. His vision board at home looked different now. Gone were the flashy cars and red carpet photos. In their place were quotes about craft, about authenticity, about the journey rather than the destination. And in the center, a simple reminder: the most important role you'll ever play is yourself. The morning sun streamed through Le Papillon's windows as Marcus prepared for another day of service. He watched as his colleagues arrived, Sandra with her endless wisdom, Jake with his quiet determination, Chef Michel with his passionate perfectionism. These people whom he'd once looked down upon had become his teachers in their own way. "You know," Jake said, adjusting his bow tie, "I saw one of those videos again yesterday. The ones from that night. Hard to believe that was the same you." Marcus nodded, understanding completely. It was hard to believe. That version of himself seemed like a character in a cautionary tale now, a role he'd played but could never play again. As he straightened the tablecloth at table 7, Marcus reflected on everything that had changed. He was still pursuing his acting dreams, but the desperation was gone. He'd learned that every moment was an opportunity to practice his craft, not by pretending to be someone else, but by being more genuinely himself. The door chimed as the first customers of the day arrived. Marcus straightened up, ready to greet them not as potential networking connections, but as human beings worthy of respect and attention. After all, you never knew who might walk through those doors, or what lessons they might teach you. And so another day began at Le Papillon, where a simple leather jacket had taught a wannabe actor the performance of a lifetime: how to be himself. The spotlight he'd been chasing now seemed less important than the simple joy of doing good work, treating people well, and growing a little more authentic each day. As Clint Eastwood had said that night, the most important role you'll ever play is yourself. And finally, after all this time, Marcus was ready for his close-up, not as a star but as something far more valuable, a genuine human being. The end. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the importance of humility, authenticity, and the unexpected teachers we meet along life's journey. Drop a comment below and let us know about a time when someone's wisdom changed your perspective forever.